Secrets don't vanish, they hide. On the Morning Star, a man disappears from a locked compartment, leaving behind only a blood-stained clue. Who can you trust when every passenger has something to conceal? In The Silent Passenger, the truth lies in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered. Stay with me. This is a journey you won't forget. The snow fell softly over Ravenholm Station, blanketing the cobblestones with a silvery sheen that muted the bustling activity of the platform. Passengers gathered in clusters beneath the grand iron archways, their breath rising in faint clouds as they exchanged hurried farewells. The glow of gas lamps bathed the scene in golden light, creating an ethereal contrast against the dark, hulking shape of the Morning Star. Steam hissed and billowed from the train's engine, curling like ghostly fingers around its polished body, lending the moment a sense of timeless elegance. Evelyn Gray lingered near the edge of the platform, her gloved fingers lightly gripping the handle of her modest valise. She tilted her head back to take in the towering engine, her breath catching in a mixture of awe and anticipation. The Morning Star was not just a train, it was a legend, a traveling sanctuary for the wealthy and the secretive. Its reputation for discretion rivaled its opulence, making it the preferred choice of those who wished to journey in comfort and silence. The muted clang of a porter's trolley brought Evelyn's focus back to the present. She stepped forward, her booted feet crunching against the snow-dusted ground as she approached her carriage. Her gaze flicked over the other passengers, cataloging faces and movements with the practiced detachment of a travel writer. Each figure seemed to carry with them an invisible story, their presence on this train a piece of a larger, unseen puzzle. Mrs. Harriet Woodford stood near the door of the first-class carriage, her fur-lined coat draped over her shoulders like a regal mantle. Her silver hair was swept into an elaborate chignon, and her sharp eyes seemed to pierce through the bustling crowd. She held a slender cane in one hand, though Evelyn suspected it was more an accessory of authority than necessity. Behind her hovered a maid, a plain, mouse-like girl whose thin arms struggled under the weight of two heavy cases. The maid, Alice, Evelyn overheard her called, kept her head bowed, her movements quick and deliberate, as though afraid of earning her employer's disapproval. Nearby, a tall man in a finely tailored coat adjusted the strap of a leather briefcase. His dark hair was neatly combed, and his sharp features betrayed little emotion beyond a faint air of impatience. Simon Harrington, Evelyn surmised. The name carried a certain weight in business circles, though what precisely his business entailed remained a subject of speculation. He moved with the ease of someone accustomed to power, yet there was a flicker of something else in his demeanor, a guardedness, as if he were constantly calculating his surroundings. In stark contrast stood a young woman cradling a small wicker pet carrier against her chest. Her wide, nervous eyes darted from one face to the next, her grip on the carrier tightening whenever someone drew too near. She was petite, almost fragile, her simple dress and tightly coiled auburn hair lending her an air of understated vulnerability. Evelyn wondered what secrets Miss Rose Fletcher might be hiding beneath her timid exterior. Then there was Dr. Frederick Henshaw, his severe features accentuated by the high collar of his overcoat. He stood rigidly, his gloved hands clasped behind his back as he surveyed the scene with an expression of thinly veiled disdain. He struck Evelyn as the type of man who valued efficiency and had little patience for frivolity. There was a cold precision to the way he moved, as though every gesture had been carefully measured. The air brightened momentarily as a booming laugh echoed down the platform. Evelyn turned to see a portly gentleman in a bright woolen scarf, gesturing animatedly to a porter who appeared both amused and slightly overwhelmed. Charles Bellamy radiated warmth and affability, his round cheeks flushed from the cold. His jovial manner seemed almost out of place amidst the reserved elegance of the Morning Star, yet his presence brought a welcome, if brief, levity to the air. Finally, Evelyn's attention was drawn to the conductor, who moved through the gathered passengers with brisk efficiency. Edwin Royce's uniform was immaculate, his brass buttons gleaming in the lamplight. He carried a clipboard with the authority of a man who tolerated no disruptions, his sharp eyes flicking over tickets and luggage with practiced precision. Royce was a figure of quiet command, and Evelyn had no doubt that he ran the Morning Star with unwavering discipline. The shrill blast of the conductor's whistle signaled the final call. Evelyn ascended the steps to her carriage, her gloved hand brushing the polished brass railing as she entered the corridor. Inside, the warmth enveloped her, carrying with it the mingled scents of lavender polish and faint traces of leather. She found her compartment with ease and settled into her seat, her notebook and pen at the ready, though her attention lingered on the frost-edged window. The rhythmic clatter of wheels on tracks soon filled the air as the train glided away from the platform, leaving Ravenholm Station behind. Shadows danced along the walls, cast by the flickering gas lamps that lined the corridor. Evelyn could hear the faint murmur of voices, the occasional rustle of paper, and the muted clink of glasses from the dining car. Yet beneath these familiar sounds, she felt an undercurrent of something darker, a tension that seemed to pulse just beneath the surface. She had felt it first on the platform, a subtle shift in the air, an almost imperceptible current of unease. Now, as the Morning Star plunged deeper into the snow-covered countryside, Evelyn found herself drawn to her fellow passengers once more. The way Mrs. Woodford's sharp tone echoed through the corridor as she chastised Alice for some imagined slight, the way Simon Harrington's eyes flicked toward his briefcase whenever anyone passed too near, the way Rose Fletcher sat stiffly in her seat, her fingers gripping the pet carrier as though it contained something far more valuable than a mere animal. Evelyn let her pen hover over the blank page of her notebook, her thoughts already weaving a tapestry of observations and possibilities. There was something about the Morning Star that felt alive, its opulent interiors a gilded cage for the secrets its passengers carried. And as the train hurtled into the night, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that those secrets were closer to the surface than anyone cared to admit. The Morning Star was more than a train, it was a crucible. And Evelyn Gray was determined to uncover what lay hidden within its elegant walls. The Morning Star sailed through the winter night, its carriages swaying gently with the rhythm of the tracks. Inside, the warmth of polished mahogany and velvet-draped windows provided a sanctuary from the cold, but Evelyn Gray felt the sharp edge of unease lingering beneath the surface. The train's luxurious interiors might have muffled the world's harshness, yet they could not soften the tension simmering among its passengers. Evelyn rose from her seat, her notebook tucked securely under her arm. The corridor stretched ahead, softly lit by flickering gas lamps, and her footsteps were barely audible against the thick carpet. She drifted through the train with the purpose of a casual observer, her sharp eyes cataloging each detail, each interaction. Mrs. Harriet Woodford's voice reached her first, cutting through the quiet like a blade. Evelyn paused near the doorway of the first-class lounge and saw the widow seated with her maid, Alice, who sat hunched and silent at her side. "I told you to pack the blouse, not this garish thing," Mrs. Woodford snapped, her tone dripping with disdain. She gestured sharply at Alice, whose hands fidgeted nervously in her lap. "Must I oversee every detail myself?" Alice murmured a faint apology, her head bowed, her thin frame trembling slightly under the weight of her employer's scorn. Evelyn's gaze lingered on the maid, noting the way her fingers twisted a frayed handkerchief, a silent protest against the relentless pressure of obedience. In another corner of the lounge, Simon Harrington sat in a high-backed armchair, his briefcase balanced on his lap like a shield. His eyes flitted across the room, never settling long on any one person, his expression carefully neutral. Evelyn noted the way his hands rested protectively over the briefcase's clasp, as though he feared it might vanish if left unattended for even a moment. He greeted no one, his focus instead on the shadows that pooled in the corners of the room. Dr. Frederick Henshaw stood by the fireplace, its warm glow softening the severity of his features, but doing little to melt the frost in his demeanor. A fellow passenger, a wiry man with spectacles, ventured a polite comment about the weather, but the doctor responded with a terse, "Cold." Evelyn watched the man retreat, dissuaded from further conversation by Henshaw's curt indifference. At a small table near the window, Rose Fletcher cradled her wicker pet carrier as though it were her lifeline. Her pale knuckles stood out starkly against the dark wicker, her eyes flitting nervously toward the door whenever footsteps approached. Whatever lay hidden within that carrier seemed to weigh heavily on her, and Evelyn found herself wondering what could inspire such dread. Across the room, Charles Bellamy filled the space with his jovial laughter. His stories of past adventures spilled out in booming tones, punctuated by grand hand gestures that nearly toppled his teacup. Though a few passengers humored him with polite smiles, most offered only brief acknowledgments before returning to their own thoughts. His enthusiasm seemed to bounce off invisible walls, unreciprocated but undeterred. Evelyn moved on, her steps guiding her to the dining car as the evening progressed. Dinner was a formal affair, the polished silver and crystal catching the light in an understated display of elegance. The passengers gathered under the soft hum of conversation, though their exchanges carried an unmistakable undercurrent of wariness. She chose a seat where she could observe unobtrusively, her attention drawn once again to Rose Fletcher. The young woman sat stiffly, her plate nearly untouched. She toyed with her fork, her gaze darting from her pet carrier to the other diners. Her nervous energy was palpable, and Evelyn wasn't the only one to notice. "Well, Miss Fletcher," Bellamy's voice rang out with a cheerful lilt as he gestured toward the carrier, "I do hope you're not smuggling some exotic creature aboard. Perhaps a venomous snake?" The color drained from Rose's face, and her fork slipped from her fingers, clattering loudly against her plate. A murmur rippled through the dining car as she scrambled to recover her composure. It's nothing of the sort," she stammered, her voice barely audible. "Just a pet." Bellamy chuckled, waving off her flustered response, but Evelyn noted the way Rose's hands trembled as she adjusted the carrier on her lap. Whatever lay inside, it was clear that the joke had struck too close to some hidden truth. The conversation drifted to lighter topics, though Evelyn sensed a growing unease among the diners. She found herself drawn into their exchanges, picking up on subtle shifts in tone and posture. Mrs. Woodford spoke of her travels with an air of superiority, her stories peppered with thinly veiled barbs directed at those who had dared to cross her. "I remember a journey years ago," the widow began, her voice carrying easily over the table. "On a train much like this one, there was a robbery, quite the scandal at the time. They never caught the culprit, you know. Some say the thief boarded with the rest of us, disguised as a passenger." The comment hung in the air, heavy with implication. Evelyn noticed Simon Harrington stiffen, his grip on his wineglass tightening. A flicker of something passed across his face, fear, perhaps, or anger, before he set the glass down and excused himself abruptly, his briefcase in hand. The mood in the dining car shifted, the easy flow of conversation stalling as the passengers exchanged wary glances. Evelyn could feel the tension deepening, each small interaction taking on new weight. The rhythm of the train beneath her feet was steady, yet she sensed that the delicate balance aboard the Morning Star was beginning to tip. As the evening wore on, Evelyn's instincts sharpened. There was something brewing among the passengers, a storm of hidden motives and guarded secrets. She could feel it in the air, see it in the flicker of guarded glances, and hear it in the halting rhythms of their conversations. The Morning Star carried more than its share of luggage tonight. It carried shadows, and Evelyn was determined to follow where they led. The pale dawn light struggled to penetrate the heavy velvet curtains of the Morning Star as it barreled through the snow-covered countryside. A faint frost clung to the edges of the windows, and the quiet stillness inside the train contrasted with the ceaseless rhythm of wheels on tracks. Evelyn stirred from a restless sleep, her thoughts still preoccupied with the unease of the previous evening. She rose and slipped into the corridor, finding it eerily deserted. The muffled hum of the engine seemed louder in the absence of footsteps or voices. Her plan had been to indulge in a cup of tea before resuming her observations, but she stopped abruptly as she noticed a door slightly ajar down the corridor, Mr. Harrington's compartment. Frowning, she moved closer, her footsteps cautious. The door was unlocked, though it had been firmly secured when she passed it the night before. Pushing it open further, she froze. The room was empty, the neatly made bed untouched, but her gaze was drawn immediately to the small table near the window. Harrington's leather briefcase sat there, its clasp unfastened, the top flipped open. Beside it, the single sharp gleam of a metallic object caught her eye. A key, perhaps? No, a letter opener. Evelyn's breath hitched when she noticed a tiny crimson droplet staining the edge of the window latch. She stepped back instinctively, her pulse quickening. The scene felt disturbingly deliberate, as though left behind to send a message. Gathering her composure, she turned and hurried toward the dining car, where she suspected Conductor Royce might be preparing for the morning service. When she arrived, she found Royce speaking in low tones with one of the stewards. His impeccable uniform bore no sign of haste, but the tension in his posture betrayed him. Evelyn approached, her voice calm but firm. "Conductor Royce, I believe there's something you should see." Royce followed her without hesitation, his sharp eyes assessing her as they walked. When they reached Harrington's compartment, he surveyed the scene in silence, his expression growing graver by the second. He inspected the latch, noting the faint smear of blood and the open briefcase, its contents conspicuously absent. "Locked from the inside," Royce muttered, his gloved hand testing the handle, and yet no sign of Mr. Harrington. Evelyn observed the tightening of his jaw, the subtle clench of his fingers around the edge of the door. Royce was a man who prized control, and this mystery clearly grated against his orderly instincts. "I'll need to alert the passengers," he said finally, his voice a low rumble. "No one is to leave their compartments until I've spoken with them." Moments later, the Morning Star's passengers gathered in the lounge, their faces etched with varying degrees of confusion and concern. Royce stood before them, his stance resolute, his voice steady as he explained the situation. "It seems Mr. Harrington has disappeared under unusual circumstances," Royce announced, his tone clipped but even. "Until we resolve this matter, the train will remain locked, and all passengers are required to cooperate fully." A ripple of unease passed through the room. Mrs. Woodford huffed indignantly, her cane tapping the floor with a sharp click. "Disappeared? Nonsense! He's probably sulking somewhere, avoiding the rest of us." Rose Fletcher clutched her pet carrier tighter, her pale face even more ashen than the night before. Dr. Henshaw's eyes narrowed, his lips pressing into a thin line, while Bellamy, for once, seemed at a loss for words. Evelyn observed them all carefully, noting every flicker of expression, every shift in posture. This was a puzzle, and she intended to solve it. She cleared her throat softly, drawing Royce's attention. "With your permission, Conductor, I'd like to assist in the investigation," she said, her voice measured. "I've had some experience with unusual circumstances." Royce regarded her for a moment, his sharp and appraising. Then he gave a curt nod. "Very well, Miss Gray, but tread carefully. There's more at stake here than appearances." As the passengers were sent back to their compartments, Evelyn lingered in the lounge, her mind already sifting through the events of the previous night. Harrington's tense demeanor, the way he guarded that briefcase, it wasn't just the disappearance that mattered, but the why. Whatever had been inside that briefcase was likely the key to unraveling the mystery, and Evelyn intended to uncover the truth before the Morning Star reached its destination. With deliberate steps, she began retracing her path through the train, her sharp eyes scanning every detail, her mind cataloging each anomaly. Somewhere in the shadows of the Morning Star lay the answer, and Evelyn Gray was determined to find it. The rhythmic clatter of the train wheels served as a steady backdrop as Evelyn began her quiet investigation. The Morning Star, with its opulent interiors and curated atmosphere of discretion, now felt like a gilded trap, holding its passengers in uneasy proximity. Harrington's disappearance hung over them like an unspoken accusation, and Evelyn intended to uncover the threads that bound them to one another. She started with Mrs. Harriet Woodford, finding the widow seated primly in the lounge, a cup of tea balanced on the fine porcelain saucer in her lap. Evelyn slid into the seat opposite her, offering a cordial smile. "I must say, Mrs. Woodford, this journey has been far from ordinary," Evelyn began, her tone conversational. "I imagine someone with your experience has encountered a fair share of intrigue in her travels." Mrs. Woodford's lips tightened, her sharp eyes narrowing. "Intrigue, my dear, is for those who lack discipline. I prefer order in all things." Evelyn tilted her head as though considering the sentiment. Yet Even the most orderly lives can be disrupted. I wonder if you knew Mr. Harrington before this trip? He seems like a man who might have crossed paths with many in his line of work. The question hung in the air for a moment, and Evelyn caught the faintest flicker of unease in the widow's expression. Harrington is a man of business, Mrs. Woodford replied tersely, her cane tapping the carpet, and business is often fraught with risk. Let's just say I've learned the hard way to avoid men like him. Evelyn leaned forward slightly, her voice softening. It's difficult, isn't it? Trusting someone with your investments, only to find they've been misplaced. Mrs. Woodford's grip on her cane tightened. He promised returns, assured me it was a sound venture. Instead, it was ruinous. She sniffed, her tone bitter. The man has a silver tongue and no conscience to temper it. But you'd best tread carefully, Miss Gray. Harrington's world is one of shadows and deceit. Evelyn thanked her and left, the widow's words lingering in her mind. A financial betrayal might not explain Harrington's disappearance, but it added another piece to the puzzle. Next, Evelyn sought out Miss Rose Fletcher, who was seated in a corner of the dining car, her pet carrier placed protectively on the table before her. Rose started at Evelyn's approach, her wide eyes darting nervously around the room. Miss Fletcher, Evelyn greeted gently, lowering herself into the chair across from her. I noticed last night you seemed quite protective of your companion. I've always been curious about travelers who bring pets aboard. Rose's hands tightened around the handle of the carrier, her knuckles pale. It's just something to keep me company, she murmured, her voice barely audible. Evelyn let her gaze linger on the carrier, her expression thoughtful. You seem quite attached. May I ask what's inside? For a moment, Rose said nothing, her face pale and taut. Then, reluctantly, she unfastened the latch and lifted the lid slightly. Inside, instead of the expected fur or feathers, Evelyn saw a plain envelope, its edges worn from handling. It's nothing important, Rose whispered, closing the carrier quickly. Evelyn arched an eyebrow but pressed no further. I understand the need for privacy, Miss Fletcher, but if there's anything about this journey that troubles you, I'm here to listen. Rose's lips parted, but she hesitated, her gaze falling to the table. Evelyn gave her a reassuring smile and rose to leave. The envelope was clearly more than it seemed, and Rose's anxiety suggested its contents might hold answers. Finally, Evelyn turned her attention to Dr. Frederick Henshaw. She found him in his compartment, meticulously sorting through a stack of papers. He glanced up as she knocked, his expression a mixture of irritation and suspicion. Miss Gray, he said curtly, I trust this is important? I was hoping to better understand our fellow travelers, Evelyn replied smoothly. You seem like a man who values precision. Perhaps you've noticed something unusual about Mr. Harrington before his disappearance. Henshaw regarded her for a moment, his thin lips pressed tightly together. The man kept to himself, which is often the wisest course in situations such as these. Evelyn stepped closer, her eyes drifting to the papers on the small table. One document bore an official letterhead, though the text beneath appeared faint, as though partially erased. You must find it difficult, she mused, balancing the demands of your profession with the intricacies of travel. The doctor's hand shifted slightly, blocking her view of the papers. My work is my own concern, he said coldly, and I would thank you not to pry where you don't belong. Evelyn nodded politely, but allowed her gaze to linger on the faintly smudged text. As she excused herself, a small detail caught her eye. The name on one of the papers did not match the doctor's. She returned to her own compartment, her mind brimming with possibilities. Each of the passengers she'd spoken to harbored secrets, their facades carefully maintained. Mrs. Woodford's bitter dealings with Harrington, Rose's mysterious envelope, and the discrepancy in Dr. Henshaw's credentials, all pieces of a puzzle that was slowly taking shape. Evelyn settled into her seat, her pen poised over her notebook. The morning star's shadowed corridors had much to reveal, and she intended to expose every hidden truth before their journey's end. The morning star swayed gently as it carved through the snowy countryside, the rhythmic clatter of its wheels a constant, almost hypnotic sound. But Evelyn Gray felt no comfort in its steady motion. The train carried secrets, and one of them had just made a man disappear. After her interviews, Evelyn decided to return to Mr. Harrington's compartment. The briefcase left conspicuously behind nagged at her thoughts. It was a silent witness, perhaps harboring the key to unraveling the mystery. With Conductor Royce's consent, she entered the room once more, the faint scent of leather and cold air greeting her as she stepped inside. The briefcase sat exactly where it had been left, its open mouth an invitation. Evelyn pulled on her gloves before carefully sifting through its sparse contents. A few folded documents, business cards embossed with Harrington's name, and a small notebook. But tucked inside the pocket of the briefcase's lining, she found something else. A slip of paper, its edges frayed, the ink slightly smudged. She unfolded it carefully, her brow furrowing as she read the words scrawled in hurried script, "Beware the silent one." The note sent a chill down her spine, as though the very train itself had whispered the warning. Evelyn read the message again, her mind racing. The silent one. Who among the passengers fit that description? Each of them had spoken during her inquiries, some more freely than others, but someone had carefully avoided notice, kept their presence muted. Evelyn turned the phrase over in her mind, replaying her observations. Mrs. Woodford had dominated every conversation with her sharp tongue and imperious demeanor. Mr. Bellamy's booming voice had filled every corner of the lounge. Even Rose, though timid, had trembled her way through a few halting words. And Dr. Henshaw, for all his clipped responses, had not gone unnoticed. It was Alice who stood out now, her presence as faint as a shadow. The maid moved in near silence, her head perpetually bowed, her hands busy but unobtrusive. Evelyn had scarcely heard her voice, save for the murmured apologies she gave to her domineering employer. Was it Alice? Or could the note suggest another kind of silence, a hidden presence altogether? Evelyn placed the note back in the briefcase, her pulse quickening. She needed to know more, to observe Alice in her unguarded moments. Leaving the compartment, she set off toward the rear of the train, where she suspected the maid might have sought refuge from Mrs. Woodford's constant demands. As she passed through the dining car, Evelyn caught sight of Rose Fletcher seated near the window, her pet carrier once again clutched tightly in her lap. Rose's gaze flicked up briefly, meeting Evelyn's before darting away. The young woman looked as though she hadn't slept, her complexion pale and her eyes rimmed with shadows. "Miss Fletcher," Evelyn said gently, pausing beside her. "May I join you?" Rose nodded without speaking, her fingers tightening around the carrier's handle. Evelyn slid into the seat across from her, watching as the young woman's gaze drifted to the frost-covered landscape beyond the window. "I've been thinking about Mr. Harrington," Evelyn began, her voice soft, non-threatening. "It's strange, isn't it, how someone can vanish so completely?" Rose's hand stilled, her grip on the carrier loosening slightly. "I don't know anything about it," she murmured, her voice so quiet it was nearly lost beneath the hum of the train. "I believe you," Evelyn said, "but perhaps you've noticed something, someone who didn't want to be noticed." Rose's eyes flicked to the carrier, then back to Evelyn. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came. Evelyn waited, letting the silence stretch, knowing it could be more revealing than any rushed reply. Finally, Rose leaned forward, her voice barely audible. "Sometimes I feel like there's someone else, someone watching." Evelyn's heart quickened. "Watching from where?" Rose shook her head, her expression troubled. "I don't know, but it's like they're there, just out of sight in the shadows." Evelyn nodded slowly, her suspicions deepening. She thanked Rose and continued her search for Alice. The corridors were quiet, the train's motion steady beneath her feet. Finally, near the service car, she found the maid seated on a narrow bench, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Alice," Evelyn greeted, her tone calm and unassuming. The young woman started slightly but did not rise. "You must be exhausted. Mrs. Woodford seems to rely on you for everything." "She does," Alice said softly, her voice carrying a faint tremor. Evelyn sat beside her, close enough to observe the fine details. The frayed edges of her sleeves, the faint smudge of ash near her wrist, the subtle shift in her breathing as Evelyn spoke. "You've been with her for some time, haven't you? It must feel confining." Alice's hands twitched, but she said nothing. Evelyn pressed on gently. "Did you notice anything strange about Mr. Harrington before he disappeared? Anything that seemed out of place?" Alice hesitated, her gaze fixed on the floor. "He argued with her," she whispered. "Mrs. Woodford, last night after dinner. She said he owed her something." He laughed, but it wasn't a kind laugh. Evelyn frowned. And then? He said he'd settle it soon, Alice murmured, that they'd all get what they deserved. Evelyn's thoughts churned. Harrington's disappearance, the cryptic note, the whispered warning of a silent presence. It was all beginning to coalesce into something darker than she had anticipated. She offered Alice a reassuring smile and left her to her thoughts. The Morning Star's secrets were starting to slip through the cracks, and Evelyn knew she was on the edge of something significant. Somewhere within the train's opulent corridors lay the answer to Harrington's fate, and she intended to find it, no matter how deep into the shadows she had to venture. The Morning Star's elegance and order masked a growing unease. Evelyn Gray had spent hours piecing together fragments of conversations, hidden motives, and subtle tensions, but one question gnawed at her relentlessly. How had Mr. Harrington vanished from a locked compartment? The note, "Beware the Silent One," echoed in her mind as she moved quietly through the dimly lit corridors. She retraced her steps, recalling every detail of the passengers' movements. Alice's nervous confession about the argument between Harrington and Mrs. Woodford, Rose's fears of being watched, and Dr. Henshaw's enigmatic papers all pointed to one thing. The Morning Star carried more than its manifest of passengers. There was someone else aboard. Evelyn's theory crystallized as she returned to Harrington's compartment. The faint bloodstain on the window latch seemed out of place in a staged disappearance. She examined the latch more closely, her fingers running along its edge. The smudge of blood was thin, almost brushed on, perhaps deliberate, a sign left behind. She opened the window cautiously, cold air rushing into the compartment. Outside, the narrow ledge running along the train's exterior glistened with frost. It would be nearly impossible for anyone to traverse it without leaving a trace. But inside, Evelyn spotted something faintly wedged between the floorboards near the window. A torn scrap of fabric, dark and rough, unlike the fine materials worn by any of the passengers she'd observed. She pocketed the clue and turned her attention to the train's schematics, which Royce had provided earlier. Her eyes scanned the layout, pausing on a small, seldom-used storage compartment near the rear of the train. It was meant for surplus linens and cleaning supplies, but its secluded position made it a perfect hiding spot. The rhythmic clatter of wheels accompanied her as she made her way to the rear of the train. The corridor grew colder, the light dimmer, as she approached the storage room. Her pulse quickened as she reached the door, its brass handle icy under her touch. She knocked lightly, then listened. The faintest shuffle of movement answered her. Evelyn pushed the door open, her breath catching as she stepped inside. The shadows seemed to shift, coalescing around a figure crouched near the far wall. The stowaway's eyes glinted in the low light, and Evelyn caught the flash of a blade before she raised her hands calmly, her voice steady but firm. "I'm not here to harm you," she said, "but I think you and I have something in common, a shared interest in Mr. Harrington." The figure hesitated, then lowered the blade slightly, revealing a gaunt face framed by a tangled mess of dark hair. The man's clothes were worn, his hands calloused and trembling. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice rough but laced with pain. Evelyn stepped closer, her tone soft but insistent. "Who are you? What connection do you have to Mr. Harrington?" The man's laugh was bitter, hollow. "Connection? He destroyed me, my family, everything I had." He paused, his breath shallow. "We trusted him, invested everything we owned. He promised wealth, security. Instead, he left us ruined, penniless." The words struck Evelyn like a cold gust. She knelt to his level, her voice gentle. "And now? What did you hope to achieve by following him?" The man's grip on the blade tightened. "Justice. He thought he could escape, leave behind the wreckage he caused. I came to remind him that some debts can't be buried." Evelyn studied him, her mind racing. The missing documents, the open briefcase, Harrington's disappearance. It was all starting to make sense. "You confronted him, didn't you? That's why he disappeared." The man's eyes flickered with anger and grief. "I didn't mean to. Things got out of hand. He tried to bribe me, but I'd heard enough of his lies. When he lunged for the window, I grabbed him." Evelyn felt a chill run through her. "What happened then?" "I don't know," he admitted, his voice cracking. "He slipped, fell, or jumped. I pulled back, and he was gone." The weight of his words settled over the room, the rhythmic clatter of the train a somber metronome. Evelyn glanced at the blade, then back at the man. "You can't run forever," she said quietly. "If you truly want justice, hiding in the shadows won't bring it. Let me help you." For a moment, silence reigned. Then the man nodded, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his burden. Evelyn rose, her resolve firm. She would need Royce's assistance to resolve this without further harm, but one thing was clear. The Morning Star's hidden passenger had emerged from the shadows, and the truth was finally within reach. The dining car was heavy with tension as the passengers took their seats, their expressions ranging from nervous curiosity to barely veiled suspicion. The flickering gas lamps cast long shadows across the polished wood and silverware, adding an ominous air to the room. Evelyn Gray stood at the head of the table, her calm gaze sweeping over the group. Conductor Royce loomed nearby, his stern presence enforcing order. Beside him, the stowaway, his name now revealed to be Arthur Blake, sat quietly, his hollow eyes fixed on the table before him. Henshaw, by contrast, leaned back in his chair, his features carefully composed, but Evelyn didn't miss the tightness in his jaw. "Thank you for gathering," Evelyn began, her voice steady, though the room seemed to hold its breath. "Mr. Harrington's disappearance has cast a long shadow over this journey, and it's time we brought it to light." She turned toward Mrs. Woodford. "You, madam, suffered financial ruin at Harrington's hands, losing a substantial investment. Yet your anger, while justified, was tempered by fear of public disgrace." Mrs. Woodford sniffed disdainfully but said nothing. Evelyn's gaze moved to Rose Fletcher. "Miss Fletcher, you carried documents in your pet carrier, proof of Harrington's schemes. They implicated him in financial fraud and revealed victims beyond those he publicly wronged. You feared for your safety, knowing what you carried could destroy him." Rose flushed, clutching the carrier tightly, her eyes glistening. "And then there's Dr. Henshaw," Evelyn said, her tone sharpening. "You hid your true identity, Doctor, or should I say, Mr. Past Frederick Langley, the son of one of Harrington's earliest victims. Your father was driven to ruin and death by Harrington's deceit, and you came aboard this train to settle a debt you believed was long overdue." The room erupted in murmurs, but Royce's sharp glare silenced them. Henshaw's composure faltered, his hand twitching toward his pocket before he steadied himself. "You sought revenge," Evelyn continued, her voice unwavering. "But you didn't act alone." She gestured to Arthur Blake. "Mr. Blake was your accomplice, a man whose life Harrington destroyed. Together, you planned to confront Harrington on this train, forcing him to answer for his crimes." Blake's head dipped and Henshaw's jaw clenched, the silence between them speaking volumes. Evelyn pressed on. "The confrontation in Harrington's compartment didn't go as planned. He fought back, panicked, and in the struggle, he vanished, likely out the window into the night." "You have no proof of that," Henshaw interjected, his voice icy. "No?" Evelyn's voice remained steady. The torn fabric from Blake's coat found near the window, the blood on the latch, the documents in Miss Fletcher's possession, and your connection to Blake, hidden but undeniable. Together, they paint a picture of your desperate attempt to take justice into your own hands. For a long moment, the room was silent, the passengers' faces etched with a mix of shock and grim understanding. Henshaw finally spoke, his voice low and bitter. "And what justice has Harrington ever faced? The law protects men like him, wealthy, untouchable. He ruined lives without consequence." "Perhaps," Evelyn said softly, "but vengeance in the shadows rarely leads to resolution. It only deepens the pain." Royce stepped forward, his voice firm. "We'll let the authorities sort out the rest. Until then, both of you will remain under watch." Blake's shoulders sagged and Henshaw nodded stiffly, his mask of defiance slipping to reveal the weight of his guilt. As the train pulled into its final destination, the Morning Star's mystery unraveled like the tracks beneath it. The passengers dispersed, carrying their secrets and scars into the cold morning light. Evelyn lingered on the platform, her breath visible in the frosty air, her mind already framing the story she would write. The Morning Star had carried more than passengers that night. It had borne the weight of betrayal, vengeance, and justice. Evelyn's gaze followed the receding train, the rhythmic clatter of its wheels fading into the distance. She knew that some shadows would never fully lift, but for now, the truth had been brought to light.